My mom definitely was not comfortable talking about it with me, and sort of avoided the topic at all costs.
My mom certainly had the period talk with me, and like that I'd always hinted at something else, but I never really knew what. But I knew that no one really knew about sex with women, like sex between women. So I knew that I could ask questions about like bodies or like men and women, but I knew no one really knew about the kind of sex I was probably going to have.
There are lots of ways of dividing these stereotypes because it's not just based on sexuality. But if we were to simply look at sexuality as opposed to race, gender, class, location, if we're going to look at just how, let's say, queer women are portrayed in the media, you're going to see either a really hypersexualization, so like Girls Gone Wild type thing, or you're going to see a stereotyped version of like an ultra butchy lesbian gym teacher for women. And then for men, you're going to mostly see a really hyper-feminized gay man that's very into fashion. And because of those three stereotypes, unfortunately, it has a broad effect on how society views people that are queer. I know for me it was, well, if I don't fit into any of those three, I must not be that. Yeah, so I think a big impact for that is kids growing up and figuring out their sexualities. It really hinders their ability to figure out who they are when the only images they're getting are of these really stereotyped and really unattractive ideas of what queer people are.
I was pretty confident in my sexuality pretty early on, but I didn't know how to fit into these like very rigid definitions that I saw of what that sexuality was supposed to be. The way that sexually queer people are represented has been pretty whitewashed, especially with women. I've noticed a lot more embrace of queer men of color in the media as compared to queer women of color, and I'm not a queer woman of color, so I can't speak to how that affects me or my life, but I can only imagine how that is even more problematic. I mean, I already struggled as like a middle-class white woman who can fit into anything, and I already had trouble fitting into certain definitions of sexuality. So as a queer woman of color in this country, I could see how that could make things a lot harder, and queer men of color.
It always occurs during sweeps week when they really need a lot of viewers. All of a sudden the main female character will decide she wants to try out being a lesbian for a few episodes. Going off that, some of the stereotypical storylines for queer women on television are they either die, like a grisly death. So they finally get together with the love of their life, and then the next episode are horribly killed. Most likely the woman of color in the relationship is the one that's killed.
The way that we've defined woman is wife and mother, and those are your ways of being a woman. That's how we view women. So if you're not a wife or in a relationship with a man, you need
better have a child to take care of.
to maintain your womanhood, which is really interesting.
Because God forbid you be a lesbian and a person of color and not want children.
Day of Silence got really huge while I was in high school. It was like always pretty decent, and then the GSA worked really hard to promote it, and there was like just hundreds of students who signed up and participated.
I mean, I think for my high school, it's just about like opening up the dialogue, because it was a pretty open, liberal school in the sense that everyone was for gay marriage, but no one was ever out. And so I think it's figuring out how to open up that dialogue enough that it's not just we're for gay rights, but it's actually allowing people to feel comfortable in coming out. And steps to taking that, I mean, you need role models, people that you can see in your community that are out and accepted by others. With sex ed, you also need like a stress on like women's pleasure, like that whole idea of like you understand like what men's pleasure is, but there's never a discussion on like empowering women with their own sexuality. And
we are taught to be straight by the media, in our family, not every family, but in family units, in schools. Everything around us tells us that straight is the norm. Really starting to incorporate it in like even examples you use in a math problem. Susan and Tanya get married and need to buy a house instead of Linda and Tom. Schools can play a huge part in starting younger and changing how we represent future and adulthood and beings to kids.